Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Strategy International podcast. This is the podcast produced for Strategy International, a global think tank and consulting firm that brings together great minds from across the world that get together, collaborate, and work on topics of global interest, such as international politics and diplomacy, the economy, strategy, defense, the environment, and much, much more. I highly recommend you visit www.strategyinternational.org to visit and to check out all the wonderful things that are being done over there, especially the entire back catalog of all these wonderful productions. Speaking of great minds, we have another great guest today on the program, Dr. Kalliopi Kyriakopoulou. She has studied classics and philosophy. She holds a PhD in politics and in government. She is a lecturer in politics at Badger College, Queen's University in the UK. She holds a position also of a visiting professor at the Law Department of the Catholic University in Lille in France, where she teaches geopolitics and comparative politics to undergraduate and postgraduate students. Thank you so much, Kalliopi, for being on the program.
Hello, thank you very much for hosting me.
I appreciate your time. I know that you're a very busy person, so the fact that you can take a little bit of your time to share your knowledge with our viewers and our listeners is highly appreciated. We spoke a little bit before, obviously, recording in order to prepare a little bit, and I know that you wanted to talk a lot about the UK. This is where obviously you are located, and you have a ton of experience with the politics and everything going on over there. And it's definitely interesting. And we haven't yet had an episode where we dial in on what's been happening in the UK. There's a lot of things. There's a lot of movement. Obviously, Brexit has been a big deal over there. There's a lot of moving parts in what's happening in the UK, and I'm glad that you're here to shed some light on that.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me and for agreeing to talk about UK. This is where I've been based for the last 20 years. It's a great country which is offered as a good case study when it comes to politics, when it comes to international relations, when it comes to all these paradoxes about international politics and changes, dramatic changes and swifts. Well, this is a very interesting day because tomorrow we're expecting the Chancellor to announce the budget. So it's a big day and there's a big expectation about what is going to happen. Nobody knows. We are all hoping for a cutting of the taxes, right, obviously. But we also hope for a new plan for igniting the growth in this country. Obviously, this country has been suffering, unfortunately, by a recession, which has been recognized as a recession by the government itself. And the Chancellor at the moment hopes that he's gonna propose a kind of a long-term planning for the growth. But on the other, the Prime Minister is a bit critical because I don't know if you know, but we're having general elections quite soon, the latest until January 2025. Mm-hmm. So sometimes short-term planning is better in order to attract more voters. And that comes to the point which I have to discuss here, that people in the electorate are quite dissatisfied with the current government. And it seems that already, although we have a conservative government in power for the last 14 years, there is a Labour government in waiting. Mm-hmm. And of course, we're talking about a country which is very active in the international context, a country that has been supporting Ukraine and with great enthusiasm, I have to say, and a country that is facing by-elections. By-elections mm-hmm. are happening in peripheries, in the constituencies here in the UK, when an MP resigns or when an MP passes away. So we have by-elections. We had a dramatic by-election last weekend. We have an election for the mayor of London on the 2nd of May. We don't have European elections because of the Brexit you already mentioned. And we have general elections I have to say, either in December this year or in January, the latest mid-January 2025, or earlier. Actually, to be honest, last week, before the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, came up with a speech on extremism for the first time in his career, all the everybody there was thinking that, okay, it's time for him to call for elections, but it didn't happen. We don't know what is going to happen in the next few months.
That's what it was the question I was about to ask you. Is there any risk of the elections being called sooner? Perhaps maybe the budget failing to pass in the parliament, or do you think that they will stretch it out and take the time they need to go to the maximum, which is January of next year?
I think that Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, we have to say I regard him as the scapegoat in the Conservative government, because don't forget that he was never elected. He wants to have his chance to get elected, but
Right.
he was chosen by the parliament, and he had to pay the cost of all the wrongdoings of the previous Conservative prime ministers. I think he will do everything in order to extend his time in office. But as you know, we talk about a troubled Britain in a troubled Europe in a troubled world. And the time is very compressed. Things are happening, and a lot of the decisions that have been made by this country are decisions that are driven by external reasons and crises that are feeding not only international politics but also British politics. So we don't know what will happen with the budget. If it is not well received by the people, then we might have elections. If we have something like a big crisis, domestic crisis, a security crisis, probably something will happen. Talking about crisis, I don't want to be prophetic, but you know what happened with NATO in that big leak by the German officials. They released accidentally a video that contained information about the operations of the British troops on the Ukrainian grounds, and that was something related to NATO and NATO allies, but it was a kind of a trauma for also British intelligence, right? So we don't know what will happen, but I'm afraid that nobody wants to be in power when the signs are not good. What I mean by that, according to a latest poll, the Conservatives have only something like the 20% of the electorate support at the moment, and they have reached the lowest level since 1978. 1978, we're talking about the pre-Thatcher era, while the Labour have a lead of 27% or 26%, something like this. So they have almost 47% of the support of the electorate at the moment, as elections can happen tomorrow, for example.
Right.
So nobody, there is no prime minister who wants to be there and wait for his dramatic defeat. And I think that Rishi Sunak is something like this at the moment. He's been waiting for a dramatic defeat, not only of his own party, but also of his premiership.
I want to go back a little bit to Brexit. You mentioned it. We mentioned it in the beginning. And ever since that took place in the UK, there has been elements that have been contesting it. There have been whispers of them potentially coming back into the EU. What is the sentiment over there, and how present is that issue in preparation of the next election?
Right. So I think we've been living in a kind of a post-Brexit era, and I'm saying this because even the newspapers and the weeklies do not mention the term Brexit anymore.
Mhm.
There was a period of about 3-4 years where Brexit was everywhere. Everybody was talking about Brexit, even having a coffee or a drink with friends. I mean, Brexit was at the very epicenter of your discussions. Now it's not the matter. So we have we have left Brexit behind. What I mean, the impact of Brexit? Well, I'll tell you something. There is a paradox in this country. Brexit happened, and Brexit was something huge, a dramatic detachment from a family of friends and partners. UK joined the EU in 1973. We had the referendum in 74. And okay, there is the myth that it started complaining about joining the EU since the first day it joined the EU, but it decided to leave. The referendum took place in 2016. The actual Brexit happened some years later. Did it have an impact upon the economy? Of course, it had an impact about the economy. We're talking about low levels of growth, of investment. We're talking about how problems here with building infrastructure, the housing, a big trauma on the national health system, and so on. Don't forget that UK is an economy that provides services. It's not an industrial economy like Germany. But there are two paradoxical phenomena that I want to mention here. First, take a look around Europe. Take a look around the European partners who used to be allies, good allies with UK. Do they suffer economically? Yes, they do. Take a look at Germany. Take a look at France. And the other thing is that sometimes I think the impacts of Brexit were very smartly hidden behind the impacts of pandemic. So we had two similar phenomena happening in parallel in this country, Brexit and pandemic, you remember the COVID lockdowns, etc. So we're not certain what had more impact upon the economy. But since Brexit was a big thing, it was like a breakup of a kind of a normal process. It was something like the normalization of the abnormal, we can say. It's very difficult to be certain about its impact at the moment. I think we have to wait some years until we are certain about the actual economic, social, and cultural impacts of Brexit.
It's interesting. Sorry to interrupt you. It's interesting that you're mentioning that, because in the past, any political analyst that would look into the European Union and to a potential country that could survive outside of the EU, the UK was definitely one of those countries that economically, socially, politically, they didn't really need the EU. In fact, they were never a part of the monetary union. So I'm just reading now, ever since Brexit happened, and a lot of the analysts are saying that it's going to take a little bit of time before the UK actually finds its lane, and then everything should be economically, socially, and politically okay. Is that something that you agree with?
Exactly. But don't forget also that one of the biggest arguments of Brexit was to rebuild Britain, to readdress our British identity. It was a kind of an ontological need to readdress the identity of Britain. But everybody in favor of Brexit was talking about the re-emergence of global Britain. So the big question here is, okay, Brexit happened. It's not something that we can readdress, at least for this generation. But does it mean actually that Britain became more global? Was Britain able to sign more contracts with non-European states? Is Britain more global than it used to be? And again, and it's quite surreal, if you take a look at what is going on in Ukraine, and if you take a look at the support, the military aid and economic support that Britain offers to Ukraine, you're going to see that in this regard, Britain is acting in a more European way than other European partners.
Yeah.
So, and it's quite surreal, because it's like that Britain became more European and less Eurosceptic with the crisis in Ukraine.
Right.
So not many things have changed, actually, right? It's like Europe, it's like Britain needed a kind of an opportunity to show to the rest of the world that it matters in Europe.
Can this be set as an example, as a precedent in the future for other countries? Because you mentioned one of the main objectives was to regain, the British identity, and we have been seeing in the last number of years, a re-questioning of this EU ideology. A lot of countries want to maintain their own identity. We're seeing it a lot more in the Eastern European countries where they believe that, their sovereign rights should supersede this EU-centric vision that has been established. And there's a huge debate, obviously, happening in Europe about this. But I was always curious, given the fact that the UK managed to do this, and if in the next couple of years they manage to find that lane and succeed sort of independently from the EU, is that going to be used as a pretext for other countries in the European Union to follow in that example?
Yeah, the question here is whether Brexit means more disintegration for Europe or disintegration for the United Kingdom. But going back to your question, European integration is a long process. It's a journey. It's not something that happens from one day to another. Right. European integration was something that happened after the Second World War to heal the wounds of the conflict in the Second World War. And it required a very important thing, and that thing was, I would say, amnesia, right? The eradication of memory of what divides us as countries in the same continent. So with this power of amnesia, which was necessary, the countries in Europe decided to forget the national differences, to forget their ethnic identities, and to start a journey together, a journey which was very difficult, of course, with a lot of obstacles, especially economic obstacles and so on. But at some point, with the crisis, with the Greek crisis, the crisis in Italy, Ireland, etc., it was evident that people are not very happy when the pockets are quite empty. And they have to remember again. And they have to forget amnesia and get a memory about what divides us. So it's not something simple. It's a very complex phenomenon. But integration is quite successful so far, and I'm talking about wide integration and deeper integration, the integration of the institutions and wide integration, because for a very core European family of states, 5-6 states, we're talking now about 27 states, right? And quite recently, we know that Ukraine is struggling to become both a member of NATO and a member of the European Union. And we have also other non-European states that want to join. Right. So it's not a union that can be that can suffer easily a kind of a trauma. Of course, Brexit is something huge. But I have to say that behind this myth of union, what the main motto of the European Union is united in diversity. It's the recognition that the states are quite different from each other, nationally, in terms of identity, economically, and so on, but they have something in common. And what is this that they have in common? It's this kind of civic identity, the recognition that they have to respect the rule of law, human rights, and so on, and they have to be revolving around the very core of liberal democracy and liberal ideas.
Yeah, so that has become a challenge in certain countries, like in Poland and in Hungary, where the European courts have kind of withheld funds.
True, exactly. And talking about Brexit, do you remember until quite recently, when Marine Le Pen in France was talking about Frexit, the detachment of France from the European Union? Well, I have some news which are not very good at the moment. Le Pen does not use the term Frexit anymore, but she's going amazingly well in the polls, because we have elections also in France in 2027, and the not National Front, because Le Pen rebranded the party, now it's Run National, the name of your party, is going extremely well. And Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, is in a very bad position because according to the constitution, he cannot run for the third time in office. Yeah. So Le Pen is doing amazingly well. She uses very well the anti-immigration, anti-Semitic argument. And there was a very recent poll in France, and the people, I think something like 45% of the people who were asked do not find her political party as dangerous to democracy. Mm-hmm. Okay, now to go back to your question, we might not expect a kind of exit for France from the European Union, but we can expect a kind of a trembling of the whole rhetoric around the European Union and this kind of unity that should characterize the member states. So Brexit can be a good starting point for a severe critique towards the authoritarian and sometimes bureaucratic way that the European institutions treat the member states. And these are not my words. These are the words that are coming from governments like the ones you mentioned, Hungary and Poland, and also France.
Right. You know, it's interesting that you're mentioning, this anti-Muslim or anti-anything policy in a lot of these countries, and especially given the circumstances around the world right now. There's been a shift in Europe where, in the last decades, most of the countries in the EU were pretty homogenous nations, right? I mean, you think of Greece, you think of Italy, you think of, the Eastern European states, but then you have, for example, countries like France, like the UK, like Germany, that were always very receptive to immigrants. But with what's been happening now in the world, there seems to be this growing wave of migrants flowing into Europe. And I don't know how the sentiment is over there. I don't know if there is this hatred towards these nations, if there is this enmity towards them, if there is this sense of unacceptability. What is going on? Because I fear that these are the issues that are feeding the discourse, especially in countries like in France, and that has made Le Pen actually popular in the polls.
Exactly. And you know what? We have to remember that the EU member states are secular states, right? And this is very important. So the whole immigration, all the immigration policies in those states, but also the immigration policy in the EU should be characterized by this secular character, but also by the need to integrate those populations and to treat especially migrants and also the asylum seekers with decency and integrity. Is this happening? Okay, I'm going to ask you to take a look at Greece. I'm going to ask you to take a look at, the number of the people of migrants from Middle East and Northern Africa who have lost their lives in the last years. Are the people in Europe ready to welcome and invite those people? Yes and no. They are happy until they realize that this kind of invite has a direct impact on their well-being. And I'm talking about the shrinking probably of the social welfare state. I'm talking about the way the European citizens understand that the coming of all those immigrants can have an impact, not just on the economic life, but also on the cultural life. Europe the European values are characterized by this kind of secularization and this kind of tolerance. So if the people in Europe understand or realize that those values of tolerance, those values of free speech, freedom and human rights are well respected and maintained, I think they will be more open to this, but I'm not sure whether the governments are in the position to secure those values at the moment. And this is a very big problem, but it's not happening only in Europe. I think it's something that happens across the world.
It's happening all over the world. And the big question now, regardless of whether or not these countries are, have this openness or this open policy of accepting migrants, I think the main question is the economic capability of actually taking care of them.
Exactly. This is the most important thing. And from a more to be, I mean, yeah, I know I will be a bit more sensitive here, but from a social point of view, the anti you mentioned, and the anti that refers to any fence that is being, built among us and them, and every creation of us and them as a division is something that the liberal democracy across the world and in Europe should not be proud of. And I understand that there are a lot of problems, but the immigration policy is something very sensitive. You cannot ignore it, of course, but on the other, it doesn't mean that you protect or you create it and you protect your own people by creating more fences or by creating more borders. Unless we're talking about a total crisis, which is another scenario of the liberal system, of liberal institutionalism, and so on. And probably we have entered a new era of traumatic politics, and we should start discussing it.
Is it a phase, you think, that will just naturally go away? And, is it cyclical, or is it something that we should really worry about? Is it something that will settle in and cause more problems going forward?
Okay. Now, as a Greek, I have to remember Thucydides, right? Who was in favor of seeing history as in a cyclical way. I don't. Otherwise, why do we have to have these nice discussions? Why do we have to write or read history, right? History needs to have a didactic character. It needs to teach us something. But I have to say that I don't think that history repeats itself. I think that there are patterns. History has some echoes, right? There are things that happen in similar ways, but not in identical ways. But certainly we have entered a new phase in world history. We are experiencing more crises than in the past. We are in the need to tackle those crises. We have to be more prepared for conflicts, for not just ethnic conflicts, but also social conflicts. I think that crisis has been normalized in a way. Crisis is not a breakup from the rule. Crisis is the normal. So we've been experiencing a kind of normalization of the abnormal. And this is a new normal, I think, unfortunately, because we don't know what the future will hide for us.
Let's go back to the UK for a second, and this whole preparation for the election, which is very interesting, and there's going to be a lot of eyes looking into the UK to see exactly what's happening. Because aside from the central politics in the UK and what's happening, you have surrounding issues in Scotland and in Ireland, and how are those being addressed?
Well, yes. I think the most important thing is what is going on with Northern Ireland. What is going on with Northern Ireland? Well, in Northern Ireland, you know that we had years of troubles, very fragile society there, a lot of divisions between the Unionists and the Nationalists, between the Protestants and the Catholics. For the first time in history, we have two first ministers in Scotland, like tiny prime ministers in Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland has also its own parliament as a product of devolution in the United Kingdom, and they have the same kind of legal weight, but the main first minister at the moment is Michelle O'Neill, who is a Catholic, who is a nationalist, who actually is someone who is coming from the party of Sinn Féin, right? And this is huge. I mean, historically, this is again a kind of a breakup, which means what? That the first minister in Northern Ireland now is someone who is supposed to represent the opposition, but she is the dominant political figure. That means that both communities have come closer. That means that the electoral map in Northern Ireland has radically changed. Until recently, the Protestants were more, and I'm talking about the voters, than the Catholics. Quite recently, we find that the Catholics are a bit more than the Protestants. That means that this kind of unity that was enabled by the Belfast Agreement, also known as the Good Friday Agreement, decided in 1997, I think signed in 1998, Blair and Bill Clinton, right? Big legacy and big agreement. This kind of unity enforced by the agreement is now happening, actually. So what does it mean? This is huge. First of all, it means that Northern Ireland, we can say, gets closer to Ireland. But that means that Northern Ireland is being detached from the United Kingdom. And this is probably a product of Brexit you mentioned before. That's why I'm talking about a possible integration of the United Kingdom more than a possible integration of the European Union. Because with Brexit, we had an additional protocol. In order to protect this Good Friday Agreement, we didn't have a kind of hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, because those two communities needed to coexist, and we needed a kind of a peaceful symbiosis between them. So the United Kingdom, as part of Brexit, decided to have a kind of border on the sea, not on the grounds. But that means that there is a psychological border between the rest of the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland. So with now, in addition to this, with Michelle O'Neill, who is coming from the Sinn Féin being in power, that means that possibly in the future, not now, and with more young voters in Northern Ireland keeping an eye on the European affairs, possibly we're going to have something, a radical change in some years from now there.
That's interesting.
And with reunification, I don't know what. I mean, these are big things, but things are changing.
It's very interesting. It certainly feeds the argument that we were talking about before, how successful the UK may potentially become outside of the EU. And I'm just curious to see how that unfolds in the future. And we know that there's countries like Hungary and like Poland that have been looking at a similar scenario as well. And I don't know. I mean, it would be tragic to reach a point where countries are looking more towards leaving and maintaining some sort of collaboration with the EU, but maintaining that independency from the EU rather than to remain in the EU. I mean, it would be tragic, for example, for a country like France to split from the EU, which, I mean, it's, you know, France was the country that created the EU, if you go really way back.
Exactly. And, you know, this, I totally agree with you. It's a matter of keeping the sovereignty and independence while maintaining an integral part of the union, and how is it possible in those critical times. And with France, I totally agree with you. And if Le Pen gets in power, I think that the whole European Union will be at risk. Now, about Hungary, what is interesting, I'm trying to make connections with what is going on outside Europe, and I know that today is Tuesday, but it's a big Tuesday for in the United States. What will happen if Trump gets in power? Orban has good relations with Trump. Right. So we have to see the big picture here. What will happen if other things change around the world? I don't see France leaving the European Union, but I can see a kind of a breakup in the relation between France and Germany, because don't forget that, yes, France was one of the, yes, France was the state that gave birth in the idea, probably, of the European Union, but the Franco-German action was one of the strongest ones in the journey for the EU integration during the last years. And now we can see that there are a lot of divisions between France and Germany. Right. And even if you think about what Emmanuel Macron said quite recently in Paris summit in the late of February, we're going to send troops, European troops on the Ukrainian grounds if necessary. And then the German chancellor said, what are you talking about, right? You can see that there is not this kind of agreement there. And in the past, we saw France and Germany having this kind of action, which was very kind of, it was constructive for the future and the continuation of the European Union. And actually, it made the British, to rephrase a bit Clausewitz, to believe that Germany and France are just the continuation of the European Union by other means.
Right.
But we cannot see it anymore, right? There is something there which is changing.
I want to move into the conflict in the Ukraine, and you open an interesting door with the statements that President Macron said about sending in boots on the ground, and that was quickly put down by a lot of countries, notably Germany. I know that the U.S. and Canada also refused. Is that going to create a division, you think? Do you think perhaps he was maybe just testing it out to see people's reactions to it? But, a president of a country like France doesn't randomly make public declarations, right?
But a president of a country like France, who has a lot of domestic problems, might need opportunities to redirect the public from those domestic problems, right? And I think that this is exactly what Emmanuel Macron did. A lot of problems within France, and the second point, and I'm not sure about this. I'm trying. There is a vacuum of leadership in the European Union, right? And I think that Brexit, one of the products of Brexit, if we really think deeply about it, is that it revealed this kind of need to have leadership and commitment in the European Union. Probably Emmanuel Macron, with this statement, tries to convince the rest of the world that he is the moral leader of the European Union. I'm not sure, but did he have, he was brave enough to say this, but I think it was out of context. And the reasons behind this statement, I think, were deeply political and had to do with his own interests and preferences. And there weren't words that reflected the actual need of the European troops to be in Ukraine.
Well, that was my next question. Is there perhaps a need for them to be on the ground? The war's been going on for over 2 years now. There's not much advancement happening on either end. What is the next phase? What is the next phase? Because definitely from the Ukrainian side, they wish that they would have this sort of support. The Russians immediately came out to threaten anyone that would even dare bring in troops. How is that war going to evolve? What are we going to see in the next year?
Well, that's a $1 million question, right? Well, I start with something else. I'm trying to take a look at Putin's speech, the recent one, the address to the nation speech. If you take a look at this speech, he was quite adamant. Here we are here to do our job. And NATO countries and European countries that want to challenge us actually put a kind of an existential threat to Russia. This is one thing. So, and he said also that he won't hesitate to use nuclear weapons.
The weapons, yeah.
Right. So this is something big. This is something that causes a lot of concern on the other side. What I can see is that I can see two things. I can see that the stability and security in Europe, as also the UK Prime Minister has stated, depends a lot on what will happen with Ukraine. But I can see that European states have their own problems. So they will quite soon seek for a kind of a peace settlement there, whatever it means. Sending military aid, sending economic aid will not always possible when the European economies suffer. But on the other, I have I have, I don't know, but sometimes I've been thinking whether the whole debate about Ukraine has been instrumentalized by the politicians in Europe in view of the forthcoming European elections, because a lot of things will depend on the outcome of those elections. People will say what they think about their leaders. And don't forget that European elections can be a kind of beauty contests in Europe, right?
Yeah.
But they say a lot about to what extent the voters want to punish their national governments.
Right.
So I think we'll be in the position to say more about what will happen, given the outcome of the forthcoming elections in June of this year.
It's going to be definitely interesting because it's not the only conflict that seems to be dividing the European Union. You have the recent conflict in the Middle East that has mobilized attention from all over the world, obviously. How is it being perceived, at least in the UK, in your perception?
Yeah, the thing is, there is a big divide here. You know, we have. First of all, there is no unity towards this conflict in Middle East. While in Ukraine, we saw something extraordinary in the UK. Ukrainian flags, you know, in public spaces, in houses, in flats, total agreement between the government and the opposition about training 30,000 troops in Ukraine, about sending military aid, about supporting Zelensky and so on. In Middle East, things are quite different. We've been having a lot of protests in London. I mean, I can see it every Saturday, either anti-Semitic or anti-Muslim. And there is a debate also in the House of Commons about what to do with this, because there are racial incidents against Muslim communities and against Jewish communities.
Right.
The UK, and this is very, very important and very, I think it's very dangerous as well. And this is the reason why last Friday, Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister in the UK, came out with a speech about how to tackle racism in this country. And he said openly, you know what, look at me, I'm the living proof of shared values in this country. We have to be all together. And this is the reason why there is a debate in the House of Commons about redefining the concept of extremism. 10 years. And the debate is huge. I have to say also that the Ukrainian conflict has been shadowed behind the conflict in Middle East,
Right.
and we can see that in the press every day. But definitely, it's something totally different. I think it's something that raises questions about, as I said, extremism or racial discrimination in this country, and you know what? There is a division in this country in terms of what will happen in Middle East. Ceasefire, yes, no, yes, but liberating the hostages, yes or no, or to some extent or whatever. And this division didn't happen with Ukraine.
Right. It's going to be definitely interesting because we're seeing the exact same things happening over here in Canada as well. And it feels like the politicians are struggling to figure out how to confront this situation. They don't want to seem insensitive by calling it, hate speech or whatever you want, discrimination against the Jews. Most of the demonstrations here are anti-Jewish demonstrations here in Canada. So it's a very fragile situation, and it's becoming more and more obvious that the politicians don't really know how to tackle it. Or either they don't know, or they're being very careful with how to phrase things.
Exactly. And I'm really looking forward to finding out how this conceptualization of extremism will happen in this country, because you know what? It's very difficult. I mean, we have also feminist groups that are against, for example, the entrance of transgender people into female toilets. We have also other groups, Christian groups, that are against the gay marriage. So what are the borders of extremism? Yes, we understand that on the base of this conflict, on the base of anti-Semitism or anti-Muslim, etc., we need to redefine the term. But what are the borders of the term? I mean, will it include other communities or not? It's a good question, but it's a good. I mean. It's about readdressing the public debate, right? And this is how politics becomes interesting when it takes into consideration what is going on, when it takes into consideration the changing social conditions, and it tries to accommodate them in the current debate.
Interesting. I guess time will tell. I don't want to take up too much of our time. I know that you're very busy. I just want to ask you one last question. You are, of course, a Greek national living in the UK. There is a big debate right now happening about the return of the marbles. There's a huge lobby happening from the Greek side. Is there any light at the end of the tunnel, or is it just a lost effort?
Oh, well, that's a big question. You know that we need another meeting for this.
We'll do another podcast just
for
for
this
this one.
discussion. I'll tell you what it was. I think it wasn't a friendly gesture that the Prime Minister here, Rishi Sunak, didn't want to see Kyriakos Mitsotakis, the Prime Minister of Greece, when he visited the country. I think it was a bit, yeah, it wasn't kind. I don't know what will happen with the marble.
What is the sentiment in the UK? Obviously, we understand the Greek position. I don't think there's any one Greek that doesn't want the return of the marbles. But how is this perceived in the UK? Are people in favor? Is it still, debatable? Are they against it? How is it on the ground in the UK?
There is a wave of people, intellectuals, people, authors, etc., who actually are in favor of returning the marbles, right? And they think that culturally they belong in Greece and so on. But on the other, if you ask people who, the everyday people who go to the British Museum, which is a museum where you don't have to pay any ticket to go and see the permanent exhibition, right? They say that here, we have London is, cosmopolis. There are people and tourists who are coming and visit the museum, and it's a good opportunity for the marbles to be admired in this country. I'll tell you what, and this is just my personal opinion. Before that. Of course, they know, the British people, they know, and people who work for galleries and museums, they know that if a starting point is the marbles of Parthenon, then what will happen with, other pieces that belong to different countries of the world, etc., etc. But my personal opinion is, I admire the British Museum and the good work and the organization, etc., etc. But I would prefer it if it was called World Museum.
Exactly.
just to make sure that even in terms of language, it accommodates the world heritage.
Thank you so much for coming on the program. We'll leave it there. I know that we have very biased opinions on that topic, but it's definitely an interesting one. I want to thank you so much for tuning in, and to everyone listening and watching, please head on over to www.strategyinternational.org. Check out everything that is being done over at Strategy International, especially all the back catalog of all these productions and many more that are available to you. Kalliopi, thank you once again for all your time. Really, really much appreciated.
Thank you very much for hosting me. Thank you.
I hope we can do this again soon.
My pleasure.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.